We now throw you right back into Kappo and the Revs, Anne of Green Gables.
Oh, you're just the type of guy who can't live without the introduction.
Of course. Rachel Lynde had flown out the door, and Anne was halfway to the shore by now, and Marilla Cuthbert was left standing in her kitchen, completely verklempt by the disaster that had unfolded in mere moments. She looked upon the tea set that she had placed on the kitchen table and thought of clearing it, but that didn't seem right. She thought perhaps to go and pray, but also that felt like it wouldn't quite yield the results that she was looking for. The sense of serenity that Marilla Cuthbert required was something that seemed otherworldly, so she bowed her head and waited for the next moment to unfold.
It was then that Marilla heard a stirring on the back porch. Assuming it to be Angus Iverson eavesdropping, she grabbed her broom and stormed angrily out the door. She felt relieved to have a body to channel her anger towards, so she threw the door open and went to assault anything that should happen to be in her way. Marilla raised the broom, took a deep and powerful breath, and then to her dismay she saw Rachel sitting on the white wicker furniture with the hand-painted periwinkles. She was weeping. "It's that kind of child that puts strychnine in the well, Marilla,"
Rachel cried.
"I'm dreadfully worried, Marilla."
Marilla didn't respond, and Rachel continued.
"You didn't disagree with her, Marilla. You might as well have said those things yourself. I know you feel them."
Marilla had stopped short, the broom still aloft in the air, unsure how to respond.
"Oh, are you going to attack me as well?"
Rachel sobbed. Marilla couldn't respond. She felt paralyzed by the situation, her only communication being that she calmly dropped the broom to her side and looked upon her friend with as kind an eye as she could muster.
"I used to pity you, Marilla, being unmarried, but now I see that you are incapable,"
Rachel cried.
Marilla made a deep sigh and smiled upon her bosom friend. She placed the broom against the wall and sat down next to Rachel, placing her arm around her and said with a loving laugh,
"Perhaps you're right about that, Rachel dear, but I bet Thomas sometimes wishes you were never married."
The two shared a hearty laugh. "Oh, Marilla, whatever are you going to do?"
Rachel said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Well, I think I'll take her over to Matilda Blewett tomorrow morning,"
Marilla said sternly. "Oh, Marilla, how could you say something so cruel? I'd rather hear you say that you'd planned on throwing her down a flight of stairs and into a fiery furnace than hand her over to Maddie Stilden. What a cruel fate. A bullet in the head would be kinder,"
Rachel said, showing her first genuine concern for Anne, albeit in a very nasty fashion. "Well, then never you mind what I plan to do. I'll figure this out on my own,"
Marilla said, losing her temper again and returning to her prickly demeanor. "Oh, I'm not vexed with you, Marilla. I feel far too sorry for you,"
Rachel said as she raised up and excused herself, leaving Green Gables, perhaps for a final time. Marilla felt a terrible guilt come over her. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen, and while she had felt some of those things towards her lifelong friend, she would have been happy for none of them ever to be spoken.
As Marilla sat heartbroken by her own actions, as well as those of her new orphan, she saw Anne returning home. Marilla's heart ached as she felt the sting of Rachel's words and how they must have felt for Anne, much like they had felt for her all those long years ago. Her heart never hardened, but her tongue always did, and as Anne approached Marilla, stunned herself at what came out of her.
"Anne Shirley, how dare you speak that way to Mrs. Lynde?"
Anne didn't respond. She only quaked before Marilla.
"What kind of upbringing has allowed you to think you could speak to an elder in that fashion?"
Again, Anne's only response, very uncharacteristically, was a trembling lip and pitiful green eyes that pushed tears onto her blaze-red cheeks.
"You will go to Mrs. Lynde and apologize right now."
"I will never apologize to that woman. You may do whatever you like to me. Put me in a dark dungeon full of snakes and toads and I won't complain, but I can never apologize to Mrs. Lynde."
Anne seethed, full of conviction that reminded Marilla far too much of herself. "If you plan on staying at Green Gables, you will apologize to Mrs. Lynde,"
Marilla commanded, feeling the need to apologize for herself as well, but she would never admit it. "Then you'll have to send me back to the orphanage,"
Anne screamed as she dropped to her knees and lay pitifully in the dirt in front of Green Gables. "That would be too kind for someone capable of such incredible outbursts. You can go to the East Field and weed those crops until your hands are as red as your hair."
Marilla said, feeling awful for having said it, but for some reason, much like Anne, she couldn't stop herself once she got started. Anne did as she was instructed, suddenly full of a proud and new purpose. She reveled in her new role as she stomped off to the field for a hard day's labor, rather than having to apologize for the horrible slings and arrows she'd flung at her new neighbor.
Matthew had been quietly watching the entire drama unfold as he ducked his head next to the fence post just a few meters away. He cleared his throat, let loose a bit of a stinker, and approached his sister. He looked at Marilla, and the two exchanged an hour's worth of conversation and a few awkward glances until Matthew finally spoke.
Rachel Lynde deserves what she gets.
Oh, I won't hear any of that from you, Matthew. You should have seen the display that your Anne with an E put on for Rachel Lynde.
Oh, I heard it all right. The whole county heard it,
Matthew said, assuming the earshot of the community was as keen as his own, which it was not. I suppose you'd say she shouldn't be punished at all,
Marilla said, throwing her hands up and rolling her eyes deeply.
Remember, brother, when we decided to keep her, you promised not to put your oar in.
Matthew didn't respond. He walked away from Marilla and left her to stew in her own emotions. The day passed slowly and ended with a tense dinner with no conversation whatsoever. Anne excused herself with a bow and went up to her room for the night. Marilla, in her consternation, left for a walk down by the brook.
Matthew had retired to the parlor for a nice smoke on his pipe and to think deeply about the situation at Green Gables. He didn't want to interfere, but he had to make things right. Matthew loved his sister Marilla deeply. He loved Anne even more now, and he had even felt a kinship with the Lyndes that was mostly unspoken. He checked out the window and saw Marilla still making her way down the drive, slowly and sadly. He felt he had at least 15 minutes or so to check on Anne, so he quickly shot up the stairs and quietly entered the room.
I haven't been in this room in years,
Matthew said with a cheery smile, and Anne peered over her covers to reveal her tear-stained face.
Oh, Matthew, will my life ever be anything other than this constant besetting against the outside world?
Matthew chuckled and said with a smile,
Well, mine hasn't been. I think you fit in here awful well, Anne. She said some awful things to me, Matthew. Prince Edward Island is a beautiful place, but it is inhabited by some cruel and unfeeling women.
Anne sobbed.
Well, I won't argue with that.
Matthew chuckled and tousled Anne's already disheveled hair.
I thought you'd be an awful nice addition to this island. How could I ever apologize to that woman? I'm not sorry at all, and I don't say things that I don't mean.
Anne scowled.
Well, couldn't you just go and kinda smooth it over?
Matthew said calmly.
You don't want me to go, do you?
Anne said with a new tear shining from the corner of her beautiful green eyes.
No, I don't want you to leave, and I don't want you weeding those fields either. Marilla is a terrible, determined woman, and I know she won't change her mind. Well, Matthew, I suppose I could apologize to Mrs. Lynde if you wanted me to do it. Just don't tell Marilla I was up here. She'll say I was interfering,
Matthew said, looking out the window and seeing Marilla returning up the drive.
Wild horses couldn't drag it from me,
Anne said, wrapping her arms around Matthew, and the two shared a warm and tender moment before Matthew tore down the stairs, relit his pipe, completing his ruse before Marilla re-entered the room. The next morning, as Marilla readied Matthew's breakfast before the dawn, Anne appeared in the frame of the kitchen door and proudly announced,
Marilla, I'm ready to apologize to Mrs. Lynde.
That is as I expected, Miss Shirley. Head up to your room, wash up, and we'll walk down to the Lyndes once I've cleared Matthew's breakfast,
Marilla said, shooting Matthew a knowing grin.
Matthew chewed his piece of side pork with an extra bit of gusto, and when Marilla broke her gaze, he shot a look at Anne that said,
Well, thank you, girl. You really are a kindred spirit. Marilla, with a glib sense of satisfaction, said with her back turned,
You see, Matthew, I told you that if we left her be, she would come to her senses.
Anne and Matthew nearly broke into laughter, but somehow kept themselves composed just enough not to arouse Marilla's suspicion. Marilla could feel something happening behind her back, but when she finally turned from her dishes, she found herself alone in the kitchen.
Now there's only 33.3% of people keeping the devil at bay at Green Gables. Those two will be the death of me.
Marilla laughed to herself with a wide grin and a happy heart.
Before Angus Iverson could rouse himself out of the chicken coop, Anne and Marilla were dressed and making their way down the drive.
Marilla, you look positively elegant.
Anne beamed, touching the hem of Marilla's finest Sunday dress. You don't go to make an important visit in kitchen clothes, Miss Shirley,
Marilla said, slapping Anne's hand away from her garment. Oh, of course, Marilla, but I don't have anything quite so beautiful. Do you think Mrs. Rachel will accept my apology, even if it comes in this awful wincey dress?
So long as your words are as plain and to the point as your dress, Mrs. Rachel will listen to you. She's a fine Christian woman and one of my oldest friends.
The two made their way down the drive, and Thomas Lynde greeted them from the garden.
Good day, Marilla, Miss Shirley. Come to speak to Rachel, I suppose. I wish you both well. She came home in quite the fracture last night. Yes, I suspect she did,
Marilla stated with a smile. Oh, Mr. Lynde, you must understand. I never meant to...
Anne said before Marilla interjected. Never mind Thomas, Anne. He understands.
Marilla laughed.
Good luck to both of you. You were in my prayers last evening,
Thomas said with a grin as he returned to his groundskeeping.
Anne and Marilla approached the back gate of the Lynde home to see Rachel staring daggers through the both of them. Anne had chased ahead of Marilla by a few paces and opened the gate like the centurions rolled away the great boulder, and she ran up to Rachel, knelt before her, and began to weep.
Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry. I could never express all my sorrow, no, not even if I used up a whole dictionary. You must just imagine it. I behaved terribly to you, and I've disgraced the dear friends Matthew and Marilla who have let me stay at Green Gables, although I'm not a boy. I'm a dreadfully wicked and ungrateful girl, and I deserve to be punished and cast out by respectable people forever. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper because you told me the truth. It was the truth. Every word you said to me was true. My hair is red, and I'm freckled and skinny and ugly. What I said to you was true too, but I shouldn't have said it. Oh, Mrs. Lynde, please, please forgive me.
Anne had given the performance of a lifetime, and Marilla gave a great sigh and rolled her eyes deep into their sunken sockets. Rachel, however, didn't possess the same sort of cunning as Marilla and was in absolute rapture by the words that came so freely from Anne.
Oh, of course I forgive you,
Rachel said, beginning to cry.
You mustn't mind me, girl. I'm known throughout these parts as a woman who speaks her mind.
Thomas coughed from the garden and drew the look of the three women. He clumsily dropped his trowel and fell to his knees himself, disappearing behind a painfully well-kept rose bush.
You mustn't worry yourself, child. I knew a girl whose hair was just as red as yours, but as she grew, her hair turned into a handsome shade of auburn,
Rachel said, looking at Marilla, who was busy flicking her braid behind herself.
Oh, Mrs. Lynde, you've given me such hope. I will always consider you a benefactress,
Anne said as she wrapped her arms nearly all the way around Rachel's wide frame and tugged her close into a warm and meaningful hug. What had started as an eccentric performance had now become a full-fledged love affair. Will the two of you stop this?
Marilla scowled.
You're as bad as those old fools who act at the White Sands Hotel.
Marilla, what this child needs is some proper exposure to what being a lady of Prince Edward Island is all about. Trial or no trial, you ought to put this girl into school.
Rachel bellowed, still holding on to Anne tightly.
Well, there's the church picnic next weekend. Perhaps Anne could be matched up with that young Josie Pye. She's such a fine young lady,
Anne said with a world of possibility cascading from her green eyes.
Oh, Marilla, what say you?
I say that the two of you are the most piebald fools I've ever laid eyes on. Stop clutching at her like that, Anne. That's enough,
Marilla said as she plotted their getaway.
Rachel, I thank you for your kindness. Truly, you are the picture of a proper Christian matriarch,
Marilla said, forming her own apology of sorts. Why, thank you, Marilla. Won't you two stay for tea?
No, I'm afraid not,
Marilla said, knowing full well not to trust anything that came out of the Lynde's well.
We've got duties to attend to at Green Gables.
Oh my, of course. Well, Anne, I must say I had my doubts about you, but you seem like you might turn out all right anyways. Thank you, Mrs. Lynde. I know if I could turn out to be half the woman you are.
Anne, that's enough,
Marilla shouted halfway to the drive. Goodbye, Anne girl,
Rachel said with a smile. putting a tight little bow on this scene from Kappo and the Revs, Anne of Green Gables.
Or was it? Sordid noises emerged from the back room, and the close observer might notice a cat o' nine tails flailing against a cucumber that seemed too large to be real in the shed out back of the Lynde's property. Tune in next time. We'll never mention it again. Bye!